October 14th, 1963, 11:47 p.m. The sound of 5 sets of footsteps echoed through the empty corridor of 7th Avenue as Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked alone toward what should have been his final moment on Earth. The shadows moved wrong that night. Too deliberate, too coordinated. What Bumpy didn't know was that Vincent, the Chin Gigante, had put a $20,000 bounty on his head, and the 5 men closing in behind him weren't street thugs looking for a quick score. They were professionals, the kind of men who made people disappear so completely that their own mothers forgot their names. But here's what those 5 hitmen didn't know about Bumpy Johnson. Here's what Vincent Gigante didn't know when he signed that death warrant. Here's what nobody in New York's underworld understood about the quiet man in the perfectly tailored suit who controlled Harlem like it was his personal chessboard. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who looks like he doesn't belong there. You have to understand something about Harlem in 1963. This wasn't just a neighborhood. This wasn't just a place where people happened to live. Harlem was a nation within a nation, with its own laws, its own king, and its own way of handling those who stepped out of line. And Bumpy Johnson wasn't just some small-time hustler who got lucky. He was the mathematical mind behind every numbers game from 110th Street to the Harlem River. He was the silent partner in every legitimate business that mattered. He was the man who decided which cops got paid and which ones got transferred to Brooklyn. But most importantly, Bumpy Johnson was the man who understood that true power isn't about how loud you can shout. It's about how quietly you can whisper and still have the entire room fall silent to listen. The Italian families downtown had been watching Bumpy's operation for years, watching and calculating. Vincent Gigante had run the numbers himself. Bumpy controlled approximately 60% of the illegal gambling revenue in Manhattan. His network stretched into legitimate businesses, political offices, and police precincts in ways that made even seasoned mobsters nervous. The Chin had done his homework. He knew that removing Bumpy Johnson wouldn't just eliminate competition. It would open up the most lucrative territory in New York City, like cracking open a safe filled with gold bars. What Gigante didn't calculate was the loyalty factor. What he couldn't measure was the respect that Bumpy had earned not through fear, but through something far more dangerous, something the Italian families had never quite mastered in Harlem. He had earned love. The plan was simple, elegant even. 5 men, 3 different escape routes, 2 backup vehicles positioned at strategic points along 7th Avenue. 1 target walking alone at nearly midnight on a Tuesday, when the streets would be empty enough for a clean operation but not so empty that gunshots would echo without the cover of normal city noise. Tommy Torino had studied Bumpy's routine for 6 weeks. Every Tuesday night, Bumpy walked from Marcus Garvey's old headquarters on 7th Avenue down to 125th Street, then caught a cab home. Always alone, always taking the same route, always vulnerable for exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds between the safety of one building and the safety of another. What Tommy Torino didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson never did anything the same way twice. What looked like routine was actually randomness disguised as pattern. What appeared to be vulnerability was actually bait. And on the night of October 14th, 1963, the fish were finally ready to bite. Marcus Williams was 17 years old and stationed on the fire escape of a tenement building overlooking 7th Avenue. His job was simple: watch for police, signal if anyone was coming, keep his mouth shut afterward. Marcus had been working for Bumpy for 8 months, running numbers and delivering messages. He thought he knew what he was looking at when he saw 5 men in expensive overcoats spreading out in formation behind Mr. Johnson. Marcus thought he was watching an assassination. What he was actually watching was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The first shot came at 11:51 p.m. Tommy Torino's .38 Special, fired from approximately 40 feet behind Bumpy's left shoulder. The bullet should have entered Bumpy's skull just below his left ear and ended everything before the other 4 men even had time to draw their weapons. Instead, the bullet shattered the window of Sammy's barbershop and sent glass cascading onto the sidewalk like deadly confetti. Bumpy Johnson had dropped to one knee and rolled left in a movement so fluid it looked choreographed. But here's what nobody watching understood. Bumpy hadn't heard the first shot. He hadn't seen Tommy Torino raise his weapon. He had felt something else entirely. He had felt the weight of 57 people watching from windows, fire escapes, and doorways throughout the surrounding blocks. You see, what Vincent Gigante never understood about Harlem was that information traveled faster than bullets. Word had reached Bumpy's network approximately 43 minutes after the 5 hitmen took their positions, not through phone calls or messengers, through something far more sophisticated, through the invisible web of grandmothers on stoops, children playing stickball, and shopkeepers sweeping their sidewalks, through the kind of community intelligence network that the FBI would have paid millions to infiltrate. Bumpy Johnson knew he was walking into an ambush. He had known for hours. The question wasn't whether he would survive. The question was whether he would send a message loud enough for Vincent Gigante to hear it all the way downtown. Tommy Torino's second shot went wide when a garbage can exploded next to his right foot. He spun toward the source of the explosion and found himself staring at a 12-year-old boy with a slingshot and a pile of cherry bombs left over from the 4th of July. The boy's name was Jerome Washington, and he had been positioned on that rooftop since 9 p.m. with very specific instructions: make noise, create confusion, disappear. By the time Tommy realized what was happening, Jerome was already gone, and the other 4 hitmen were firing blindly into smoke and shadows and the growing sound of sirens that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. But here's the thing about those sirens. Here's what made Vincent Gigante's plan fall apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Those weren't police sirens. Frank Morrison owned an auto repair shop on 126th Street. His brother Eddie owned a taxi company. His cousin Robert drove an ambulance for Harlem Hospital. On the night of October 14th, 1963, all 3 men happened to be testing their emergency equipment at exactly 11:52 p.m. Pure coincidence, according to the police report filed the next morning. Bumpy Johnson stood up slowly as the 5 hitmen realized they were surrounded by noise, confusion, and approximately 24 Harlem residents who had suddenly decided to take evening walks despite the October chill. He straightened his tie, brushed dust off his jacket, looked directly at Tommy Torino, who was still holding his smoking .38 and trying to understand how a simple assassination had turned into a neighborhood block party. That's when Bumpy spoke the only words he would say that entire night. "You boys look lost." His voice was calm, conversational, the kind of tone you might use to ask about the weather or comment on the baseball scores. But every man on that street heard something else in those 4 words. They heard the sound of a door closing, the sound of chances being used up, the sound of Vincent Gigante's $20,000 bounty becoming the most expensive mistake of his criminal career. Tommy Torino was found 3 days later in a car trunk at Kennedy Airport. The other 4 hitmen were discovered over the course of the following week in various locations throughout the city. None of them had been shot. None of them had been beaten. None of them had been tortured. They had simply disappeared from their lives so completely that when their families reported them missing, the police couldn't find any evidence that they had ever existed in the first place. But here's what really happened to those 5 men. Here's the part of the story that Vincent Gigante never learned. Here's the detail that turned Bumpy Johnson from a Harlem crime boss into a legend that people still whisper about 60 years later. Bumpy Johnson didn't kill those 5 hitmen. He bought them. See, what nobody understood about Bumpy's operation was that it wasn't really about crime. It was about economics. It was about providing opportunities in a community where opportunities didn't exist. Tommy Torino had 3 kids and a wife with medical bills that were drowning him financially. Eddie Marchetti owed $47,000 to loan sharks and was facing the kind of consequences that would leave his children without a father. Bobby Castellano's mother needed surgery that his legitimate job could never afford. Vincent Gigante had offered them $20,000 to kill 1 man. Bumpy Johnson offered them new lives. Tommy Torino currently runs a legitimate construction company in Chicago. His children graduated from college. His wife received the medical treatment she needed. He sends Bumpy Johnson a Christmas card every year, though the return address is always different. Eddie Marchetti owns a restaurant in Detroit. The loan sharks who were threatening his family mysteriously decided that his debts were forgiven in full. His oldest daughter is now a doctor. Bobby Castellano moved to Los Angeles and works in the film industry. His mother lived another 23 years and saw all 4 of her grandchildren born healthy. The other two men chose different arrangements, different opportunities, different lives far away from Vincent Gigante's reach and far away from the violence that had brought them to 7th Avenue on that October night. But every single one of them understood the lesson that Bumpy Johnson taught without ever speaking it directly. Loyalty can't be demanded. Respect can't be stolen. Power can't be taken by force from someone who gives it away freely. The genius of what happened on 7th Avenue wasn't the way Bumpy Johnson survived an impossible situation. It was the way he turned Vincent Gigante's greatest weapon against him. Those 5 hitmen weren't just neutralized. They became advertisements, living testimonials to the idea that working with Bumpy Johnson was more profitable than working against him. Within 6 months, Vincent Gigante's organization lost 17 key members to better offers from Harlem. Within a year, the Italian families stopped trying to expand north of 110th Street. Within 2 years, Vincent Gigante himself was asking for meetings with Bumpy Johnson to discuss territorial agreements rather than territorial conquest. The failed assassination on 7th Avenue didn't just save Bumpy Johnson's life. It redrew the map of organized crime in New York City. Marcus Williams, the 17-year-old who watched everything unfold from that fire escape, went on to become one of the most successful legitimate businessmen in Harlem. But he never forgot the lesson he learned that night. The lesson about the difference between fear and respect. The lesson about the power of community. The lesson about the way real strength shows itself not through violence but through the ability to turn enemies into allies. Jerome Washington, the 12-year-old with the slingshot and cherry bombs, grew up to become a police detective. He spent his entire career working to keep Harlem safe, and he never once arrested anyone who worked for Bumpy Johnson. Not because he was corrupt, but because he understood that some forms of justice happen outside the courtroom, and some forms of order exist beyond the law. Frank Morrison, Eddie Morrison, and Robert Morrison continued their legitimate businesses and raised their families in Harlem. But on quiet October nights, when the wind was right and the streets were empty, they sometimes tested their emergency equipment, just to make sure it worked, just to remind the neighborhood that some sounds mean help is coming, even when help wears an expensive suit and carries secrets instead of a badge. And Bumpy Johnson? He continued walking alone on Tuesday nights, different routes, different times, different destinations, but always alone. Always confident, always carrying himself like a man who understood that true power isn't about the enemies you destroy. It's about the enemies you transform into something better than they ever imagined they could be. The story of what happened on 7th Avenue spread through the criminal underworld like a slow-burning fire. It became the kind of tale that gets told in whispered conversations in back rooms and prison cells, the kind of legend that grows more impressive with each telling. The kind of lesson that changes how entire organizations think about power and respect and the difference between ruling through fear and leading through wisdom. But here's the real lesson of October 14th, 1963. Here's what Bumpy Johnson understood that Vincent Gigante never learned. Here's what separates true leaders from simple bullies in every context, whether we're talking about crime families or corporations or communities or countries. The person with the most power isn't the one who can hurt the most people. It's the one who can help the most people. The strongest position isn't the one that inspires the most fear. It's the one that creates the most loyalty. The greatest victory isn't the one that destroys your enemies. It's the one that turns your enemies into allies who fight for you more fiercely than they ever fought against you. 5 men walked onto 7th Avenue that night planning to commit murder. One man walked away having committed something far more dangerous and far more permanent. He had committed an act of transformation that would echo through decades and inspire a generation of leaders who understood that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to play by the rules that everyone expects you to follow. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose to build instead of destroy. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when not to use the strength you have. And sometimes, just sometimes, the man who looks most vulnerable is actually the most dangerous person in the room, not because of what he's willing to do to his enemies, but because of what he's willing to do for them. That's the kind of power that changes the world. One conversation at a time, one choice at a time. One moment of impossible grace when you're standing on a dark street at midnight, surrounded by people who came to kill you. And you decide to offer them something better than death. You offer them life. You offer them hope. You offer them the chance to become the kind of people they never thought they deserved to be. That's what happened on 7th Avenue on October 14th, 1963. That's why only one man walked away. And that's why Bumpy Johnson became more than just a criminal, more than just a boss, more than just another name in the long history of men who tried to control their piece of the world through violence and intimidation. He became proof that there's always another way. There's always a choice. There's always the possibility that the story everyone expects to end in bloodshed might instead end in something that looks suspiciously like redemption. Even if that redemption happens at gunpoint on a dark street in Harlem, when 5 men learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter isn't someone who wants to kill you. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter is someone who wants to save you.